Hola, bienvenidos a La Manzana Escéptica, un programa promovido por la Sociedad Secular y Humanista del Perú que busca popularizar la ciencia, sus teorías y contenidos en un lenguaje que esté al alcance de todos. En esta oportunidad tenemos a un invitado muy especial. Vamos a hablar sobre el origen de la vida, sobre qué ingredientes se necesitan para cocinar la vida en un planeta y sobre las maneras que hay de detectar vida en este universo, desde vida en nuestro sistema solar hasta vida en otros planetas. Para eso tenemos como invitado especial a David Catling, que es profesor de la Universidad de Washington en Seattle de astrobiología y ciencia planetaria. Él ha trabajado en la NASA, por ejemplo, en la misión Phoenix para buscar vida en Marte. Ya nos contará de qué se trata. Ahora vamos a pasar al inglés y van a poder ver la entrevista con subtítulos. Hello, David. Welcome to our program.
Hello.
I don't know if we can start with this big question. How do we look for life in the solar system, for example?
That's an important question, and it's one which I've considered because NASA wants to look for life and other space agencies in the solar system, and it spends a lot of money on spacecraft that are exploring the solar system. So how we go about looking for life and where we look are both important questions. At the moment, we think that the best bodies to look for life are Mars, the surface of Mars, and also the subsurface of Mars.
So that would be near the poles?
Not necessarily. So there's two questions. One is life that exists today, and that probably is under the surface because the surface is bad for life because Mars doesn't have an ozone layer to stop ultraviolet radiation. It has a very thin atmosphere which doesn't protect very well from other forms of radiation such as cosmic rays. So if life exists at all, it will exist under the surface of Mars today. There's also no liquid water at the surface of Mars that is sustained anyway. Maybe there's temporary.
Yeah, some streams, seasonally streams that just evaporate.
Whatever they are exactly, and we don't really know, they just come and go, and there may be very little water for life to use. So people think if there is life on Mars today, it would exist in an aquifer, so some kind of water which is below the ground. But maybe it doesn't exist at all today. And then the second way to look for life on Mars is life in the past. So life that has left traces, some kind of fossil evidence, some kind of chemical evidence that life was there. And then beyond Mars, in the outer solar system, we have the icy moons. So the moons of Jupiter, in particular Europa, which is covered with ice but has a subsurface ocean. And then also the moons of Saturn, and in particular Enceladus, which is a small icy moon but has jets of material coming out of its south pole. So it's like a free sample, and you can fly through and perhaps capture the samples for analysis.
So you have these geysers that are shooting water into space, and you could fly a spacecraft to collect a sample of this water vapor.
So what is coming out is water vapor and particles of ice, and also some maybe dusty stuff in this plume. And basically, there's already evidence that there may be simple organic molecules in this plume. And so what you could do is simply fly fairly low because it's not very dense, but it's denser closer to the moon. So you fly fairly low, and you could, with the spacecraft, have some kind of collector structure, collect the material. And then there's two kinds of mission you could have. One would analyze the material on the spacecraft, but of course there's a limit to what you could do. And then a more ambitious mission would capture material and bring it back to the Earth. But because money is limited, then the missions concepts that have been proposed recently are those that fly through and do the analysis on the spacecraft. Those are much less costly than bringing it back to Earth.
And what about some kind of submarine that would explore the ocean of Europa.
So I think the first thing will be a spacecraft that does many more flybys of Europa and tries to determine how thick the ice is above the water. And there's also a proposal for a Europa lander, so it just land on the surface and maybe analyze the ice there. And well, this is yet to actually be made.
It will be the first time to land on another moon of another planet.
Yes. So there's also the possibility of samples from Mars, and this is more real.
Yeah, you were telling me the sample return mission that we're planning for Mars.
Yeah, so the next rover to go to Mars, the Mars 2020 rover, will have 42 tubes. They're about this big, this long, and this diameter. And those tubes will be filled with samples that the rover collects on its journey. And then it will drop those tubes. And later, there will be a retrieval mission which will collect those tubes and take them back to the Earth. Once you have samples on the Earth, you can use the most sophisticated techniques, equipment, labs to do the analysis. So if you collect the right samples, the best samples, then maybe you can have some chance of finding past life on Mars. And you can answer other questions about Mars.
What about this rock that they found in Antarctica? It was very controversial that they could detect fossilized bacteria in the rock once they cut it. No? So
Yes.
They really look like structures, like biological structures, or they could be other stuff.
It was found in a place in Antarctica called Allen Hills. So some people just call this the Allen Hills meteorite, although there are many others that have been found in Allen Hills. But this Martian meteorite, some people did analysis in the 1990s, and there was kind of 4 lines of evidence. There were these things, structures that looked a bit like fossil microbes. There was some organic material. There was some magnetic minerals that were similar, perhaps, to some magnetic minerals that are made by bacteria. And then there were some salts which can be made by bacteria too. But later, people did other analyses, and they found reasons to be skeptical about every one of these ideas. Now, the paper that was originally published in Science magazine did not claim life on Mars. It just said possible. Okay, so it never actually said we have found life. We've just found maybe possible.
The best evidence for life on Mars?
Today?
Yeah.
Well, there isn't direct evidence for life on Mars, but there's direct evidence that liquid water was present on the surface of Mars 3 or 4 billion years ago. So we think if liquid water was there for a long period, it has rocks which are not too different from the Earth, so the chemistry could have been similar, and maybe life developed on Mars. So at the moment, we're still looking for life on Mars. I think with sample return in the future, it will be easier to answer that question.
We were discussing about the possibilities of having life on a planet or on a moon.
Yes.
And you were telling me that the chances are higher maybe in a planet because of the radiation and there are differences and the atmosphere that could encourage the development of life, something that you don't have in something like Europa.
Well, I mean, there's a big debate about how life originated. So what was the origin of life and where was the origin of life? Okay. And there are people who are organic chemists, and they do experiments, in test tubes, flasks, and so on. And they try to make biomolecules from simple starting materials. And so far, in the last 10 years, their best attempts to make biomolecules, amino acids, which are the components of proteins, lipids, which are fatty molecules that we have in cell membranes, and also nucleotides, which are the genetic molecules. Their best attempts for that work in a surface environment. And that's because some of the reactions they use have ultraviolet light that helps the reactions. So some people think ultraviolet light on the early Earth when you had no ozone layer, would have been very destructive. And that's true to some extent, but it also helps because it makes some reactions work. And it also selects molecules that are more resistant. We can ask the question, why do we only have mostly 20 amino acids that are used by biology? There's been some selection process. Why do we only have, together with RNA and DNA, we only have 5 nucleotides? There are many other types one could imagine. And these tend to be selected in chemical pathways that involve light and involve simple chemicals that you would expect in concentrated solution at the surface of the Earth. That's harder to do if you're at the bottom of an ocean where it's dark, so you have no light, so these reactions don't work. And also in a dilute solution. So to get reactions to work, often you have to concentrate materials because otherwise there's not enough molecules. That's easy to do on the surface of the Earth. Things evaporate, they concentrate. It's harder to do in a big dilute ocean.
You need ultraviolet rays, you need an atmosphere to have evaporation.
If this is the way life originated. Yeah. So at the moment, the best chemistry uses those kind of reactions and it generates actual biomolecules. Okay. At the moment, nobody's actually demonstrated that you can do the same kind of reactions, say, close to a deep sea hydrothermal vent or something like that.
Okay, but what ingredients would you think of for cooking life? So you need an atmosphere, you need carbon, oxygen, hydrogen, nitrogen.
You need all those atoms, but the real difficult thing is making, from small molecules, making big molecules. Okay. Now the way that that can be done, in particular with these surface reactions, is using cyanide. So cyanide you think of as a poison. Yeah. It's a good way to kill people. But people are unusual organisms, so are animals. The normal, ubiquitous type of organism are microbes. And a lot of microbes don't use oxygen and they don't care about cyanide. For them, cyanide is not a problem. And when life originated, cyanide may have been useful. And the reason it's useful is because the cyanide chemical can be used to add carbon again and again and again to organic molecules. You add it, you make a new carbon bond, do it again, make another carbon bond again. And you can also add in nitrogen. So nitrogen is very important in proteins, in amino acids, and also in genetic molecules, because the rings, the benzene rings in the genetic molecules have nitrogen atoms in them. They're not just carbon rings, they've got nitrogen. They're so-called heterocycle rings. So you have to have nitrogen in there. Cyanide works really well. So far, people have not been able to work out how this would happen in a deep sea.
And what about Titan? Some people believe that
yes,
that Moon is also a good candidate for harvesting life.
Well, so at the surface today, it's very, very cold. It's 90 Kelvin approximately, which is extremely cold, where everything that we normally think of, carbon dioxide, water, all of those things are frozen. So
and methane is a liquid.
But methane is a liquid or a gas.
So that could be a solvent, as water is on Earth, or not.
So you have solvents that are a bit like the material, the fuel that you put in your car, those kind of solvents. But nobody knows whether life could work under those circumstances without water, but a different solvent. And probably it's quite hard because at those temperatures, the liquid methane or the liquid ethane, which is the next, the 2-carbon molecule, at those temperatures, they're not very good solvents. Okay, so really big molecules don't dissolve very well because it's so cold. Why do we need big molecules? Well, we need a genome to be alive, and a genome has billions of atoms. Okay, so maybe you could have a smaller genome, but there must be a limit on the genome size upon which you're too small to be alive. So I think the genome is one of the things that helps define life. So my car, for example, has metabolism, right? It burns fuel, it uses oxygen, it releases waste gases, it moves, but it doesn't have a genome and it doesn't reproduce with that information that gets passed on, which is unfortunate. I would like to wake up one day, look out the window, and oh, my car has given birth to another car, but it doesn't happen.
Why is important to have certain temperature? Is the vibration within the molecules help them to connect?
It helps to, yes, it's the vibrations that help to strip off parts of molecules to make them soluble, or simply to make reactions go as well. So temperature usually, almost always, helps a reaction.
So if you have to bet, you will bet for Mars?
I think it's a good place to look for life. Yeah, I don't think there's probably no life on the surface today. I think that's fairly unlikely with the lack of liquid water and the harsh radiation environment. But I think it's a good bet for past life. I think Europa and Enceladus, we should look, because we still don't know how life originated. Maybe we're wrong. Maybe our best guess today will be a bad guess in the future, because we'll know something else. And Enceladus in particular basically is giving us free samples with the jets that are coming out of the South Pole. So you may as well take a free sample, right? Yeah. It's like at the supermarket, someone's offering you some free samples. Well, I'll try that. So we should do that with Enceladus.
They get ejected kilometers into space.
Oh, so many tens of kilometers.
Yeah, you don't have to get really close.
Except that the jets, the plumes are denser nearer the surface. So if you can fly within 10 kilometers of the surface, you'll get more material. If you fly at 80 kilometers, it's very thin, so it makes it hard.
And what about this idea of having life in balloons in Jupiter, for example? In the middle of the atmosphere.
I'm suspicious of that idea. I'm skeptical of the idea.
Because there are like currents that flow, and you could have bacteria or some kind of airborne organism that could even float or live in.
Yeah, so that was proposed a long time ago in the 1960s by people like Carl Sagan. They said, well, maybe you could have something float, which is, if you go down through the atmosphere of Jupiter, it gets warmer, so maybe you could have the right temperature and the right pressure regime. But there's a problem, which is that there are these big storms and circulations on Jupiter that take things from high up in the atmosphere, and turbulence can pull them down to where it's very deep, very hot, and basically can destroy the molecules. And we know that this is happening because we know that we see the simple molecules are being regenerated from the bigger molecules just when we look at the distribution of chemistry. So I think it would be very difficult for something to float on Jupiter because it wouldn't stay at the same level. It would eventually be destroyed. And it's also hard for life to originate. How does it originate? There's no surfaces, right? I mean, on the Earth you have air, rock. You have air, water. You have water, rock. So there's lots of different interfaces where it can be nice to live or for chemistry to get started on an interface. But Jupiter's just a mess.
You have different experiments, and they will be pre-isolated on a planet with atmosphere like
on
Earth.
A planet like the Earth or on Mars, or even on early Venus, although Venus obviously is not a place to look for life today, but could have been in the past. So I think those are the places in the solar system to look. We should definitely look at Mars.
And Pluto? There's some evidence that it may be like Europa.
Yeah, Pluto probably has a subsurface ocean. In fact, many of the icy bodies in the outer solar system probably have liquid water below icy shells.
They thought in the past that water was unlikely in the solar system.
Right, in the outer solar system.
Yeah,
because they thought it was frozen.
But water is quite common in the universe.
Water's common in the universe, and if you go under ice shells, often you'll find a subsurface ocean. There's a bet, I think, in my opinion, there's a better place than Pluto because it's closer, and that's the largest moon of Neptune, which is Triton. So Triton is very similar to Pluto, but it's closer, and we already know from the Voyager missions in the 1970s and 80s that Triton has organic molecules, it has an icy surface, it's active, meaning that there are places where there's relatively fresh ice. People never talk about Triton, but I'm a fan. So if I was to choose, instead of going back to Pluto, I would go to Triton.
Do you have a good resolution pictures of Triton?
Only from the Voyager spacecraft, so those are a long time ago. No, we don't. It would be a good place to go, and it probably has a subsurface ocean, definitely has organic molecules.
What about the exoplanets? How do we detect them, and how do we detect their atmosphere and the possibility of life in these exoplanets?
So, I mean, there are various ways to find exoplanets. The two main ways of several are looking for the transit when the exoplanet passes in front of the star.
You can use the apple
as
a star.
Well, no, the apple, I'm going to use the apple as an exoplanet, and my face is the star. Okay. So as the apple moves in front, if my face is projecting light like a star, it blocks the light a little bit, and then passes by. But the apple has to be aligned, right? If the apple's up here, it never passes in front. And the other way is that the gravitational pull of the planet affects the star, so it wobbles. So it's as if my head is wobbling because the apple exoplanet is passing around. So those are the two main ways of finding exoplanets. But these things are happening as we speak. People are finding new exoplanets all the time.
It was very difficult in the 90s to find these planets, and now they cannot stop.
Well, so the biggest bonanza of finds of exoplanets was with the Kepler Space Telescope. But there's a new space telescope which is called TESS. It stands for Transiting Exoplanet Survey Satellite. And it will find many, many new exoplanets, and also ones which are close to the sun. So Kepler was looking in a particular place where most of the stars are very far away, so the planets are far away. But the Transiting Exoplanet Survey Satellite will look at nearby stars, which is good, because then we can follow up with other observations. So this will find lots of new exoplanets, and it will find objects that are the same size of the Earth, that are orbiting nearby stars, and maybe we can then look for signs of life.
Yeah. What about the TARIS system that made the news? And they have this recreation of how the planets could look like. Some of them were Earth-like planets, and they could even predict how the atmosphere would be. How do they know the composition of an atmosphere that is so far away?
You don't really know the composition of the atmosphere. So the only information you really have is from a transiting exoplanet. Is essentially the radius, and if you also have some other information. So if there are multiple planets, the gravity can interact from planet to planet, and then you can get the radius and the mass of the exoplanet. So you get the average density of the exoplanet, and you can say, is that roughly 5 grams per cubic centimeter, which is the Earth, or is it 1 gram, 1 or 2 grams per cubic centimeter, which is like an icy moon? So you can say something about whether it's a rocky body or a very icy body. And then the things that we hear about the atmospheres are just theoretical guesswork. Right? We don't know for sure. But in the future, we will be able to look to see if there's an actual atmosphere. And the near-term possibility is with the James Webb Space Telescope. So this hopefully will go up into space in 2021. And the way you would look with the James Webb Space Telescope for an atmosphere is when the planet passes in front, some of the starlight gets blocked by a ring of atmosphere around the planet. Supposing at a certain wavelength the atmosphere absorbs the light, but it doesn't at other wavelengths. So if you look at different wavelengths, the planet looks big or smaller depending upon whether the air on that planet absorbs or does not absorb.
So you study the light that goes through the tiny atmosphere, tiny, very far away, and according to the rate of absorption of the light, you could tell the composition of that atmosphere.
Yes, you can.
But we now
first of all,
have the resolution.
First of all, you can tell if it has an atmosphere, because if nothing happens, as a function of wavelength, then it could be an airless body like the Earth's moon.
Or maybe a very thick atmosphere, or it will always filter something out.
It would always filter something if you look at the right wavelength. So the James Webb Space Telescope will give us information in the near infrared And there's a lot of molecules that absorb in the near infrared, for example, carbon dioxide, ozone, methane, carbon monoxide. So we will get some information, and also water vapor. So we'll get some information about whether these atmospheres are like the Earth's. But the problem with the James Webb Space Telescope is it can only look for this kind of information from planets that are orbiting red dwarf stars. Okay, and the reason for that is because the planet then is big compared to the small star, so there's a better signal. James Webb Space Telescope will not be able to do sun-like stars, because then the Earth is an Earth-like planet, is very small compared to the star, and it doesn't have the resolution. So that is in the future. That will have to be another big telescope, and NASA is studying these future big telescopes. So James Webb Space Telescope is 6.5 meters diameter, the mirror, and in the future there could be something which is 12 meters, and it goes as the square, the collecting area goes as the square of the diameter. So that's actually a big increase. But that will be sometime in the future, and then we can do sun-like stars. So if you measure the gases, you might be able to tell if these are the kind of gases that are produced by life. That's how you find life on an exoplanet.
No, it would be very exciting to find life in an exoplanet that is nearby. That maybe not us, but maybe a robotic mission could reach that planet in decades.
Well, that's been proposed for Proxima b, which is the planet around Proxima Centauri, which is the nearest star.
What about these nanochips or nano spacecraft proposed by Stephen Hawking that could accelerate near to the speed of light?
Yeah, so those are maybe even smaller than a cell phone. The idea is that you push the miniature spacecraft with a laser, but there's a lot of technological issues. So in principle, if you had a big enough laser with enough energy, if you could focus it.
And what about the search for extraterrestrial intelligence? Because one thing is a search for life that is probably more likely or more probable to have or to find microbial life, no? Yes. But to find intelligent life and to be able to communicate or detect intelligent life is pretty difficult. No? What do you think about the methods that, for example, SETI uses?
I think anybody who has thought about this problem would argue that microbial life is going to be much more widespread than intelligent life. So microbial life, you have to have an origin of life, and then you have to develop just some kind of simple chemistry, metabolism, genetic capability. To get to intelligent life took a long time on the Earth. Okay, we didn't have the first fossils that you can see of creatures that maybe probably were animals until about 600 million years ago. These are creatures called the Ediacarans. We saw them, and then they disappear, and then things that we recognize that have the same kind of structures as modern animals appear in the Cambrian, which
the Cambrian explosion.
541 million years ago is the start of the Cambrian. So, but the Earth is 4.5 billion years. So the Earth went along quite happily for billions of years without animals and without intelligent life. And then only in the last 200,000 years have we had Homo sapiens. And only in the last maybe 50, 60, 70 years have we had intelligent life that is broadcasting information on the radio waves. So for that reason, most people think intelligent life that communicates is probably rare.
Yeah, but the universe is already quite old. You have maybe you had civilizations that are already gone.
Yes.
But the radio waves they created, they should still be traveling and they should get somewhere. Why haven't we heard anything?
Well, I think it's partly because at the moment SETI is a small operation. Okay, it's funded privately for the most part, and they've sampled some stars in radio frequencies and and looking at for optical signals. So the amount of search has been very small compared to the size of the Milky Way so far. But that will change, and it is changing. So they're looking at more and more systems, and so far nothing. So it may be that there's a choke point. This is the so-called Fermi Paradox. Why haven't we heard from extraterrestrials, or more to the point, why are they not here? Why haven't they traveled to the Earth? And the explanation is maybe something is difficult in the path to get to intelligent life. Maybe the origin of life, just to get started, is difficult. Or maybe that's easy, but then going from a microbe to a multicellular, complicated organism is hard. Or maybe going from a multicellular organism, there are plenty that are not intelligent. Apple trees, right? They're not particularly intelligent. They're great to eat, but, doesn't say much. So plenty of multicellular life is not particularly intelligent. And then maybe that's a choke point. And then maybe technological life is very rare. So, for example, the dinosaurs, they were on the Earth for 170 million years, very long time compared to humans, which is just the last, Homo sapiens is just the last 200,000 years. But no one has found a dinosaur microwave oven or a dinosaur cell phone or anything like that, even a simple tool. So the dinosaurs were fine because some of them had big teeth and claws, and those were successful ways to live. You didn't need a cell phone, or you didn't need a civilization. You can be successful without that.
No, maybe the dinosaurs developed cities and traveled into space, and they colonized our planets, and when the meteor came, everything was destroyed because it just fell into the city.
Well, except they'd been around for 170 million years, so they left lots of bones and signs of that they were here. And if they did have a civilization, you might expect to find some sign of that in the fossil record, right? Because it wouldn't all be destroyed by the asteroid. It was just hit in one area. But so far nobody's found any sign of that. So one possibility is that going from complex life like a dinosaur to the form of complex life that communicates and has a civilization and has radio waves and has spacecraft and so on. Maybe that's just hard. We don't know.
Probably you don't believe in them. But what is the probability of having a world conspiracy to hide the fact that aliens are visiting us? For example, the WOW signature that the SETI captured. They capture a series of non-random numbers.
A WOW signal.
The WOW.
Was it possibly a SETI signal? And people have tried to find it again, but there's nothing, right? It was just a one-time thing.
Maybe an interference of an Earth signature?
No, that I think people who have looked at it generally think that it was not an interference. There's no explanation for it, but the problem is it's just a one-time thing. If it was a civilization broadcasting, you would expect them to continue. You wouldn't. So nobody knows what that was.
And this mega structure that they found blocking one star, and they thought it could be artificial because of the way it blocked the star, and then they proposed that the best explanation, it was just debris, space debris.
Right. I mean, in science, we always take the simplest explanation. There's a sort of theorem called Occam's razor, which is that usually the simplest explanation is the one that is correct, right? So if you find some footprints in the snow, it's probably not some strange creature, but maybe the person next door, okay.
Like the story of the face on Mars, no? That
Yes.
Was very controversial in the 70s. And then they scanned the area and they discovered basically is a way that you looked into the hill at that time of the day, and the resolution, it generates some shadows, but when you look at the structure objectively, it doesn't look like a face.
Because we have high resolution pictures now with a different sun angle, and it doesn't look anything like a face. It was just a poor resolution picture with a particular shadows that made it look like a face.
And even if it looked like a like a face. It could be a coincidence. I mean, there are many hundreds of pictures, maybe thousands of pictures of Mars, different angles. At some point, you're going to see things that you can recognize. No?
Yeah, but I think in clouds, everybody as a child has looked at a cloud and seen maybe a rabbit or a sheep or something. I mean, this is very common. We look at things and we see patterns and pictures. But, you know, the constellations, the ancient people looked up and they thought they could see a bear or they thought they could see a swan and so on. But, you know, clearly they're not bears and they're not swans. So we often like to look for pictures and faces and things that humans like, but doesn't mean anything other than what it's telling us is not about intelligence elsewhere, it's telling us about our own intelligence, right? So this is a common problem with the humans, is that we hope for something and we project ourselves onto that something. It could be a problem with exoplanet research, because in the future when we have this data, people will really want to find signs of life, and maybe they'll overinterpret the data and they'll find something which is, you know, not very good and claim that it's life when perhaps it isn't. SETI, but the advantage of SETI, I mean, there are many disadvantages, okay, that so far nothing has been found. It's like buying a lottery ticket. The prize is great, but, you know, you may never win. And also the funding is difficult. It's a difficult career to just do that. But the advantage of SETI is if you do find a signal, say a prime number or pi, a series of prime numbers, or say that the number pi is broadcast, 3.1415, etc. I mean, then it becomes clear that there's no ambiguity in a SETI signal, right? About finding life. There's always some ambiguity, or there can be, about finding life on Mars, finding life on Europa, finding life from exoplanet spectra.
In the 30s, probably, they will find out if there is life on Mars, or if Mars had life. No? What if that is the case? How do you interpret that? Two planets close to each other with microbial life. This would mean that there should be microbial life all over the universe, that it should be quite common if we find two genesis in the same solar system.
If you find two genesis of life, then yes, I mean, life will be everywhere in the cosmos. In fact, it could be everywhere, because we don't know. Simple microbial life. So I sometimes talk about an analogy. In the 1600s, or going back before the 1600s, nobody knew that microbes are everywhere on the Earth. They're on your face, they're in your mouth, they're on my hands, they're on this apple, they're inside this apple, hopefully not too many. They're in this cup, they're everywhere, okay? You would think if something is everywhere, people would know, but they didn't until the invention of the microscope, okay? And then a Dutch man, Anton van Leeuwenhoek, was looking down and he saw these things that were a shock. Nobody knew about these things. And now we know that was the beginning of microbiology.
The discovery of a microcosmos.
Yeah, so that was technology-limited knowledge. And I think whether there's life on exoplanets is also technology-limited knowledge. At the moment, we don't quite have the technology to see if maybe microbial life is very common. Maybe microbial life is everywhere and it's changing the atmospheres of billions of exoplanets and we just can't see it yet. But as soon as we have big telescopes, it'll be obvious that life is everywhere. That's one possibility. On the other hand, it could be the case that life is extremely rare, and when we look up at the night sky, you know, we're just seeing a theater of clockwork, physics, and chemistry. So there's two possibilities. In the future, it could be possible that a father or an uncle speaks to children, or a teacher speaks to children and is able to say to them, "Oh, look at that star up there. That one has a planet with life around it, and so does that one," right? We may actually know that information, which would be incredible. and very awe-inspiring.
No, like we do now, we say, I know that that's a binary star because when you look through a telescope, you see 2 points instead of one. And in the future, you could classify the systems, the ones that have microbial life and the ones that are sterile.
Or there could even be, oh, that one has an oxygen-rich atmosphere, and maybe, for all we know, there could be animals on that planet that are breathing. So I think...
So if we find a second planet or moon in the solar system with life, it does suggest that microbial life is quite common in the galaxy, probably in the universe. But it doesn't tell us how common is the origin of life, because you have an origin of life only once in a galaxy, and then from one planet or one moon, it could spread to the entire galaxy like a virus.
Well, but if that's true, we should be able to diagnose that, because we would see from the biomolecules, from the genetic information, that these organisms are related, even distantly. We can already do that with life on Earth. So supposing a situation where life got started on Earth and it went to Mars. Now we could find life on Mars or ancient signs of life on Mars. Provided the biomolecules are still preserved, we should be able to determine, oh, it's the same kind of DNA as us, and we can relate that life to us from the number of mutations.
And there's a way to tell out if the life that we find in Mars is due to contamination from Earth?
Yes.
Because
yes.
sometimes, yeah.
Because then
we get confused because the robots are not completely sterile. They could contaminate and seed Mars.
Well, all we'd have to do, we'd have to look at the genetic material, and then we'd find, oh, this genetic material has the same sequence as these bacteria that are common on Earth, or these other kinds of microbes.
The simple explanation will be contamination, or wow, maybe we are all Martians and we all came from Mars.
If we're all Martians, there should be, there would still be DNA, but it would be quite different from modern organisms. There would have been many more mutations and changes to the genome would have happened over the 4 billion years.
So you count the amount of mutations?
Yeah, in proteins and also in the genetic molecules. Yeah, it's just like modern molecular biology, the techniques that those people use. But I think people have come to the opinion that probably life elsewhere, based on chemistry, will use similar biomolecules. They may not use the same 20 amino acids that are predominant in life on Earth. They may use different ones, but they will probably still use amino acids and proteins, because proteins do so much in chemistry that it's impossible to imagine any other molecules could behave like that.
What about chemistry that is not organic, for example, based in silicium?
I think one could imagine maybe other forms of life, but they all have problems. And for example, silicon in water, the long molecules break apart, and also silicon can't make the diversity of bonds that carbon can, because carbon can bond with oxygen and nitrogen itself, and it can have double bonds, triple bonds, and so on. So silicon doesn't have this. In fact, silicon has a problem, which it tends to form compounds where it gets stuck. So silicon dioxide is quartz, what you have in sand on the beach, and you can never get the silicon out. But carbon dioxide is a gas, and you can get the carbon out and put it into organic molecules.
It's more common, carbon than silicon.
Yes, and also silicon tends to get trapped in rock minerals as a silicate, and once it's a silicate, you can even melt it, and it's still a silicate, and so it just doesn't come out. So I think other forms of chemistry are difficult, but there's one exception, which is artificial life. So if we make robots in the future that are not organic, then these could be very useful, because they can go into space, you can turn them off, and then you can turn them on again later, so they could travel the vast distances of space. And some people have suggested that the robots could even take over from human beings on Earth, that there will come a point when artificial intelligence is more intelligent than a human being, and then it can design new artificial intelligence, even more intelligent, and so on and so on and so forth.
Organic life could be obsolete at some point.
Well, yeah, in a sense, and perhaps the really advanced civilizations in the universe are not organic beings, but some kind of descendants of robotic life.
Or maybe a bionic life like the Borgs of Star Trek, that they assimilate civilizations.
Well, I think people are already beginning to fuse with technology, because when I look at my students, you know, sometimes if maybe I'm being boring, but they're fused to their cell phone, you know, like this.
They need to have it implanted in their brain.
Well, that's the next step, you know. So I can see this happening.
Thank you very much for coming to our program. Just one last question. If you had a blank check for research, and you could destine that money into research for exoplanets or planets in the solar system, or search for extraterrestrial intelligence, what problems do you think are the most important to solve at the moment about the origin of life?
Well, I mean, if I had a blank check, so I had as much money as possible, definitely I would put more money into just solving the problem of the origin of life.
In which way? Like experiments on Earth, or maybe missions to Mars?
There are not many people working on this problem in experiments on Earth, right? It's actually a small group of people. And yet, it's one of the big unsolved problems of science. How did the origin of life happen? Where did it happen? So I think more money needs to go into the origin of life. Because you think about it, when in physics, you know, you want to find a new particle or something, and then millions and millions and millions of dollars put into these big accelerators. Why is the origin of life not something that attracts that kind of money? And yet it's just as big a problem, because it's fundamental to the whole of biology and also our sense of existence. So I think more money needs to go into the origin of life in the lab on the Earth. More organic chemists, more biochemists need to be thinking about this, and physicists as well. Then, yeah, definitely we need to explore Mars. We haven't explored Mars very much. When you count up the number of landers and rovers, it's still pretty small. And also get samples back here. For analysis. It would be nice to have a mission that flies through the plumes coming out of the south pole of Enceladus. It would be nice to analyze those plumes. So I would definitely have a mission to Enceladus. There is no mission right now. No space agency has a mission.
To any moon?
To Enceladus. The NASA has a mission to Europa. Which is in the planning stages, but it's funded.
Europa has this reddish surface. That's organic material?
It doesn't have a clear spectral signature of being organic material. We don't know what it is. So it could just be minerals, right? Okay. Possible, of some description. So that's one reason to have a lander on this, is then you can do this kind of analysis. So yeah, I mean, a Europa lander would be great, and maybe NASA is going to have that. I mean, it is something which has been studied.
They have explained the origin of elements in stars and nuclear fusion, the origin of complex molecules, organic molecules. More or less, they have explained the RNA and how the DNA comes from the RNA, but there are some holes. Which part is the biggest mystery of this transition?
Oh, the origin of life. It's how you get the biomolecules, and those biomolecules turn into a cell, a functioning cell, right? So RNA world, as it's called, which is this stage of life, is something which is still being studied. There's still some holes there to make self-replicating RNA that does it on its own and doesn't have a PhD student adding things to make it work, right? That still needs a lot of study, but going from basically simple molecules that are in the environment to biomolecules that then join up and the amino acids become a protein, which is an enzyme, a catalyst, and that the catalysts work with the genetic molecules, which then makes a reproductive system, which is what biology is. That hasn't been done. And also the energy process, the metabolism, hasn't been. What was the first metabolism? How did that get started? We don't know any of this, right? So that's why I think it's a big problem which doesn't get the research money that it deserves, really. And yet it's essential for our understanding of looking for life in the solar system or elsewhere and so on. But if we find life elsewhere, it tells us something about the origin of life. I mean, that it's not a miracle, that in fact it's probably common.
So you're staying a few more days in Lima, and then you're going back. What are your plans for the future? Are you going to get involved in some new research?
That's a big question that I wasn't expecting about what I'm going to do myself in the future.
Maybe you plan to retire, I don't know.
No, I'm not that old. Well, I am actually working a little bit on the origin of life, not from the perspective of an organic chemist, because I'm not an organic chemist, but from the perspective of what was the environment like and how does that favor some kind of origin of life versus another kind of origin of life. I'm definitely going to continue studying what we know about Mars and the possibility of life on Mars, and also how to find life on exoplanets, and the possible variety of different exoplanets that maybe are like Earth but maybe a bit different. Is it possible to imagine that Earth could have evolved in a different way if it's around a different star, and so on. So I think there's lots of problems to work on. The difficulty is deciding, okay, all these ideas, which one should I focus on, I think.
Thank you very much for coming to our program. It was very interesting talking about these new discoveries. I hope that next time you come to Peru, you give us a call. Okay. So we can talk further about these very interesting topics about astrobiology. I think it's quite philosophical to try to answer these questions about the origin of life and the ultimate fate of the universe. How can we know how life will evolve or end if we don't even answer the origins of life? No?
Yes, I would say that it is still a bit philosophical, but it won't be in the future because we'll have data. Okay, so the history of human thought has been: you start with philosophy, yes, you introduce science, and then you introduce, some kind of objective reality. Yeah, I think the origin of life and whether life exists elsewhere is moving in that direction. We're not too far away. It's just round the corner in terms of the next decade and we can maybe get some answers for the first time.
Yeah, for centuries, philosophy has asked these difficult questions: the origin of man, of life, of the universe, and science is really answering one by one these questions with quite efficiently, no? I guess.
Yes, exactly. I mean, Aristotle over 2,000 years ago wrote a book where he called On the Heavens, and he considered the question of, are there other forms of life elsewhere? His answer was no, because the Earth, in his view, was the center of the universe, and it didn't make sense philosophically to think of things beyond the Earth. But what's good about science is that we don't need to ask old men or old women their opinion about things. We can actually have data that gives us a true answer to a problem. So I think we're moving in that direction, away from philosophy and opinions to some kind of reality which is based on evidence.
I think it's fundamental to question these philosophical ideas that had in some way interfere with the development of science. No? Aristotle, for example, thinking that heavy objects fall faster than lighter objects, or that the Earth was the center of the universe. No? Well, thank you very much for coming. I hope you enjoy the rest of your stay in Peru, and hope to have you next time.
Okay, thank you very much. It was a pleasure.
Bueno, esta fue una edición más de La Manzana Escéptica. Estuvimos hablando sobre el origen de la vida, la manera de detectar vida en otros planetas. Estuvimos hablando sobre la posibilidad de vida en Marte y en lunas como Europa y Encelados. Y espero que nos veamos en la siguiente edición. Chao.